Ladies and gentlemen, I hope your week is going beautiful. I hope that you're in the arms of the person you love, or you woke up with someone with whom you've always desired. I hope the sun is shining. I hope the birds are singing, and I hope the wind is at your back. I got an incredible show for you today. We're going to get into some interesting topics just about healing and nature and psychedelics and all kinds of interesting ways in which one can begin to see the world anew. I have with me the one and only Marissa Kosolofski. I hope I pronounced that right. I should have asked you before I introduced you. I hate when I do that. She's a psychedelic advocate, community builder, and the creatrix of the Golden Thread Studio, an online wellness studio specializing in breathwork journeys and self-care practices. Her mission is to create connection such that people are present to the beauty of the human experience and the magic of everyday moments. It was born from her own psychedelic assisted transformation. We're going to get into it today. Marissa, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, George. I'm super stoked to be here with your community, but just really, share the story and share the vision. Randall Hansen, I think, is probably the catalyst that brought us here today with his book Heal. And so I think both of you, I don't have my hard copy version yet. Canada Post.
Oh, that's perfect. Right here, Randall. We got you, buddy.
Canada Post is being pokey puppies. They're pretty notorious. So a lot of our friends and family will send us from the States, will send us Christmas cards. I don't get them until January.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to getting my book and being able to hear and read about all the other contributors. I've been catching some of the stories from your interviews, and they've been really beautiful. I'm excited to be able to be part of this group. So
yeah, there's something incredible about all the people that have taken part in this. And I think that this is it's sort of a snapshot of a bigger community, because even though we're all together and we got to tell our story with Randall and all this community, I think everyone is either about to be on a journey, in a journey, or coming out of a journey. And I do love this group, and everybody I've spoken to and everybody's story that I've read has been incredibly passionate. But we could talk a lot about other people. Let's talk about you, Marissa. Like, what do you want to start at? You want to start out with the transformational journey? You want to talk about like who you were before you became who you are? Where do you want to start at?
Yeah. Well, I think, when we kind of like look at those journeys, starting out, I was working in corporate America. I was working for a global beauty company. I was leading North America. So I was a senior manager, and I took the role really serious. Like, when I think about who I was back then and who I am now, there's definitely aspects of her still alive and well, trust me. But just like, you look at these societal constructs of being a firstborn, and having these kinds of like conditioning presented upon you in such a way where I was really stuck. And at that time, it would have been about 2017. And there was a series of life events that really put me in a spot of burnout, in such a way where I was showing up at the office at 7:30 in the morning. I would eat through my lunch. I wouldn't take breaks. Just a lot of seeking that kind of external validation and worthiness based on emails, awards, rankings,
Totally.
like all that kind of stuff, right? And then one day, my boss was murdered. Whoa. And that really put things into literally a screaming halt. Time kind of stood still there for a period of time. And I got really present to the fact that you don't know if tomorrow's going to come. Like, you literally don't know. And he was an incredible leader within the beauty industry, and it really halted our community. And it halted our community in such a way, but then eventually the business had to go on. And there was one moment in one of our meetings where I looked around and I thought to myself, if I walked out in front of a bus and got off today, everybody would feel really bad. It would be the talk of the office. We would have a luncheon. Everybody would go to my funeral. And then eventually, we still need to deliver the numbers for the shareholders. However, my husband and my son and my loved ones, my nearest and dearest, this would affect them for the rest of their lives. And who am I being for those people right now? Like when I pulled back and looked at the ROI of my time, like it makes me like kind of gaggy to like think like that's how I was relating to life at that time. I gave them my worst parts. I would show up. I would move through the bedtime process with my son only to get through it so I could get back behind my laptop and fire off emails until 10 o'clock at night. And it was this endless cycle, and like propping yourself up with a glass of wine because it's like nighttime and you're like, oh, well, I want to relax. And, you almost kind of like wonder what you're doing this all for, anxiety was high at that time. I wasn't taking care of myself, not really eating properly. And if I was, it was just like on the go. So it wasn't really mindful, not exercising, not moving my body. I might have moved my body from one office room to the other. And then one day, I got invited by some friends of mine, some customers and, artists, beautiful artists. And I think that was the thing, was I managed artists. And there was always like that part of me that was like I got to that spot within the community, within the industry, because I started out as an artist. But one of the things that I was really good at was translating. So I could translate the language of the artist to the language of corporate. So essentially being able to be in these C-suite meetings and speak on behalf of the hairdresser and speak on behalf of the artists, and then take that communication and then come back from the C-suite and speak to the artists in a way that was meaningful and landed for them. But as I climbed the corporate ladder, I started to really like lose all that. I lost what brought me joy, which is art and the act of creation, right? And so I got invited to Burning Man. And, I was like, well, what the hell, let's go. And so I went with my husband, and it's like a whole different world, man. There's all these memes. You'll see these memes on the internet about people who get started talking about Burning Man, and like, that's me. You kind of don't shut up. So you have to like watch yourself, because you start kind of looking like a weirdo. But I think when I go back to that time, like there's all these different aspects. So it's this community, about 75,000 people, art, spirituality, Mother Nature, you're off the grid. And so one of the things that like was the catalyst for my transformation was, I remember riding my bike, and all of a sudden, and it was midday, it was about 2:00 in the afternoon. And I remember thinking to myself, or all of a sudden I heard this voice, and it was almost like separate. And it was like, well, fancy meeting you here. And it was kind of like, had this like cheeky charge to it. And I remember kind of like looking around and being like, whoa, who's there? But we're on bikes and we're like cruising full tilt. And I kind of was like, was that me? Like, what's going down here? Right. And I'm like, well, I can be here. I can be having fun, like kind of thinking. And it was almost like this like dual conversation started to happen. I'm like, well, I can be here too. And it's like, please, you're you're so straight and stuck. You don't even know how to have a good time if it like bonked you on the head type of a deal. And I remember thinking, like kind of like taken aback a little bit by it. And the voice was like, I could teach you how to have fun if you just let me. And it was like right then I dropped into this knowing that I was almost speaking to like my inner child, this playful entity that had gotten lost long, long ago. And if you can imagine, like kind of like on a swing, twisting like this and just kind of like, whatever, old lady, you don't belong here, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, totally.
And I just remember, like, as I was like right before she arrived, right before that voice arrived, I remember just feeling this tremendous sense of freedom, this tremendous sense of joy and adventure and wonder and awe and all of these emotional states that I hadn't accessed since I don't even know when. And, you know, having that interaction, I promised myself like I would start taking better care of myself. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go. You say you want to show me how to have a good time. Let's rock and roll. When we go back home, you show me how to have a good time. And so there's this conversation about like the default world. When you go back to the default world after Burning Man, you're never going to be the same. And I wasn't. I think one of the things that was a little bit tricky was, you know, I was a mom. I had a 2-year-old son. Everyone around me was in corporate. I had maybe a handful of people who I had participated in Burning Man with, but there really wasn't anybody that I could share this experience with where I wasn't worried about either like losing my child or losing my job. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You
totally.
think about psychedelics where it was and where we are today, like in 2017, like how fast things have dimensionalized and like there's more awareness, there's more conversation, an allowance for the conversation of psychedelics. But at the time I was like, what the hell happened? And and there was so much more about Burning Man that really struck me, whether it was the art, whether it was Mother Nature, whether it's just being like off the grid, but being able to kind of sit there and be like, how can I be in that state of joy more often and for longer periods of time? So it was almost showed up as like my North Star. And then when we returned to the default world, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
I didn't realize like how poorly I had, like how I didn't know how to take care of myself until it was just like so awkward, right? I'm like, well, what even makes me happy, you know? And it kind of like I look back on that and I kind of feel a little bit sad about it. But you know, you start out with like small things, like whether it was like journaling or starting to take breaks. I know that sounds so miserable, but just like putting a reminder on my phone, and I would go out and I'd take my heels off and I'd stand on the grass on like one of a pretty decently busy street in Los Angeles. And I'd be standing out there in this corporate business suit, barefoot, for 5 minutes. I give myself 5 minutes, try to ground, breathe, and do these like little meditation exercises. And slowly and surely, I started being able to kind of like stack. So when I think about Randall's book, I think he's got some other things in there like somatic body work. So I started taking myself to yoga, just kind of like really learning how to be in my body. I know there's a whole bunch of other different ways that we could go in this conversation. So I just wanted to like take a moment and see if you have any questions before we go.
Yeah.
Continue.
So when I think of people, an individual having an incredible experience through psychedelics, and be it through breath work or be it through a substance or nature or, you know, so any one of these modalities, on some level, especially for Gen Xers like us, it seems to me that you found the beginning of the second mountain, where life has become more meaningful and you're no longer interested in doing things that are meaningless. And I'm curious, you've spoken a little bit about coming back to the default net. I always say the default mode network, which is like the default world where people are going along the way in which they've always lived in sort of this same style of mundane life, all that. But when you begin to have this new experience, it's like all your relationships around you change. And you said, I was a mom. I was a mom. When you came back, you were still a mom, but a different kind of mom. I'm wondering if you can if maybe you can explain to some of the listeners, maybe what happened to your relationships, to your relationship to yourself and the way in which you relate to your environment and everyone that was in your life?
Yeah. Great question. So I returned and my heart was blown wide open.
What does that mean? Tell people what that means. I'm with you. I know exactly what it is, but I love to hear people put it into words.
I know. Now I'm feeling, which was kind of a pain in the ass.
Love it. Love it.
Now I'm feeling, and I'm feeling like corporate culture, which is a lot of times based on doing more, and not necessarily it's like this drive. And for someone who has anxious tendencies and is highly driven, I would get a lot of reward in that space. I would get a lot of very positive feedback. People love it when you're trying to deliver and produce more and achieve, right?
Yeah.
And then now all of a sudden you come back and I remember being so struck one time on the playa, just waking up, or not waking up, but just kind of, I guess, waking up.
Sure.
It's 6 a.m. sunrise. And I remember just looking around, and who knows when anybody had their last shower. Everybody, it's a hot mess out there. We're dancing. It's 6 a.m. Everyone's dusty. And I just remember being so struck by how beautiful people were. And it was just more or less the energy. And you couldn't tell people's social constructs of who they were in the world. If they were a somebody, as per what society would say in terms of their financial income, their job, whatever, we're wearing all these crazy self-expressed outfits. So you could kind of be whoever you wanted to be. And so who do you want to be there? And now I'm back in this other world. And when you've been a yes girl your whole life, and then you come back and all of a sudden you start learning how to say no, or discovering what it feels like to say no, it actually kind of shows up in subordinate to people. So that was a bit tricky. All of a sudden I'm no, I'm not going to get that into you anymore. I'm going to actually have dinner with my child and read a bedtime story, or I'm actually not going, I don't have the resources or the capacity to be able to deliver on time the way I used to. And so there was kind of a little bit of friction. And when I think about my husband and my son and how I was showing up as a wife and mother to them, a lot more present, a lot more connected, also a lot more interested in how can I nurture that little girl. So there all of a sudden became, not only was I now parenting my son, but I found myself now very interested in how do I parent that little girl? Who is she? And wanting to discover what are her interests, And so looking at, I'm going to start riding my bike now. I'm going to start wearing a little bit more self-expressed kind of clothes. I don't want to wear this anymore. I want to wear that. I found myself really gravitating towards art, really finding a lot of solace in going to museums, and starting to hang out with creatives. One of the things that I grew up on a farm, and so was really used to like country music and top 40. And so being exposed to DJs and the electronic music scene at Burning Man was something that was like my ears had never really heard it that way before. And so started going to DJs and just dancing, like that somatic experience of like drumming and beats. And I would take our son, we would either go to, you know, little festivals or whatever that were child friendly. Um, but really starting to kind of like look at what are these ways that I can replicate that experience. I know I had mentioned before at the time, the world of psychedelics was still kind of on the cusp of like coming through. And so one of the things that I had found was flotation chambers. So I started going and practicing at flotation chambers. I started going to hot yoga to try and like mimic that experience of like the heat from the playa. I started going to Kundalini yoga. So one of my girlfriends invited me that. And that particular experience was, I would say, the catalyst that kind of turned me and tuned me into breath and its relationship with the body and mind. I remember, and it's kind of like in my story where we'd been doing like, I don't know if we were on our 11th minute of ego eradicator. And so you've got your arms up above your head and you're breathing really heavy, like you're panting like a dog, and you're going and you're going. And this was my first time. And I thought we were going to be doing like your traditional downward dog. And here I am. And I just remember thinking to myself, my God, if I knew how to breathe like this, maybe I could have birthed my son, because I had an extraordinarily challenging birth story with my son. Um, I think halfway through, I just got really scared. And when you get scared, you contract and you pull in. And when you're birthing, you need to like release and surrender to the process. And yeah, he and I had a pretty challenging time. And I just remember like, God, I don't know how to use my body. Like my body and I are not in cahoots with each other. And so, yeah, just kind of like going through this process. And so whether it was flotation chambers, yoga, hot cold therapy, saunas, all the things, like Los Angeles is like a beautiful smorgasbord of all kinds of healing modalities. But Los Angeles also has some pretty notorious traffic and nothing close to each other.
Right.
And coming from the salon and spa industry, I remember thinking to myself one day, being like, God, like, where's the full service one-stop shop? Like, you can get your hair cut, colored, your nails done, and a massage all in the same spot. And that's kind of where I was like, I always thought I would leave corporate culture and open up a salon. But now I'm like, I go back to that moment on the playa when I was thinking about how beautiful people were. And, my husband was in fashion. And so modeling, and you can take some of the most beautiful people, but if they don't feel good about themselves on the inside, it doesn't translate. They're like empty and it's hollow. And I was like, how can I translate and gravitate this beauty on the outside and start curating it on the inside? So people look like, not only do they look good, but they like have that energy, that like heart-led energy that just radiates. And so that's really kind of where the journey began. Thinking that, yeah, I would like to open up a wellness studio with some of these different practices. And, at the time, we felt like it was time to move back to Canada. And so that was kind of where the next phase of the journey began, was moving back home to Canada. And I was going to ride off into the sunset and open up this wellness studio. And then we just actually rode off into COVIDian times. We moved in with my folks so that I could birth my daughter. And I was training for meditation. And yeah, I was just like really barefoot pregnant on a farm. I think about my pregnancy with her versus with my son, and it's like night and day. But, life was like pretty optimistic. And then the weekend that we were coming out to Calgary to check out commercial and residential real estate was the weekend that the world shut down
Mhm.
and we were landlocked. And that's when I got to meet some like pretty amazing teachers called Grief and Rage. So I don't know. Have you ever had those teachers come knocking on your door?
I have. It might be one teacher with two masks, all right?
Ah, yeah,
They seem to
yeah,
go either hand in hand or just switch around and wear masks, and both great teachers, and they tend to work in pairs, and one time one shows up and then before you can even see them leave, the other shows up. At least that's the way it was for me, or they would switch places and I wouldn't know. But yeah, I have. I've seen people really close to me die and be left under, questioning why. And the
hmm,
question of why seems to be the siren call for grief and rage to come into your life. Why me? You might as well
yeah,
call them both in your house right now. What about you though?
right.
How did these two teachers show up for you?
Yeah. Um, I would say that one of the dynamics that I find myself often dealing with is like magical thinking.
Hmm.
Um, and living in America, I really had been bought and sold the American dream. And if you do good things will happen to you. Um, and there's always, the hero's always going to come and save the day, and the villain, like that kind of mentality. And sometimes shit happens and there's nobody that's coming to save anybody. I know that sounds like really
Yep.
like hard. Um, but yeah, like when we're met with trauma, it's a growth opportunity. We can really look at it as a growth opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, but I really had it that um, when you finally align to your purpose and you're operating from integrity, the universe just like rolls out this red carpet and is like, ta-da! And it kind of didn't. Kind of didn't. Um, all of a sudden, we're in all these different lockdowns, and the province that I was in had some pretty exceptional ones in our
Mm,
country. And I'm at home with my folks. And so now I'm at the origin of a lot of my conversations. Um, so when you think about like those disempowering conversations that you tell yourself
mhm.
in the dark corners of your mind, um, that's kind of where a lot of them originate when you're a little person, kind of in the familial relations.
What do those conversations sound like?
Mm, they sound like, why didn't you think of that? You should have known this by now.
Mm,
And there's others, I'm sure, but
yeah.
when you think about kind of like when they run and run, you can get stuck.
Mm,
And when I think about like the stress cycle, you'll have like a stressor, right?
yeah.
And you'll get this emotional response. Stress floods your body. So when you think about fight, flight, or freeze,
Right.
when you're when you're a little person, you're not really big enough to fight against people, right? Like the adults in your life. And a lot of times you kind of can't run away. Um, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think there's a lot of folks in our age demographic where we were taught you can't, you can't act like that around here, or don't you be angry with me, or don't you be sad, or like any of those kinds of like difficult emotions, go to your room and come back
Mm.
when you're done. Like, and all of a sudden now you're an adult and you're back this in this environment, and you're looking through adult eyes, and now you're kind of like, well, hey, wait a minute, you actually can choose differently, and you're not. And do you know what I mean?
I know
And
exactly what you mean.
yeah, you look at kind of like the elders, your aunts, your
Mm.
uncles, the folks that, you know, you had to obey, like obedience. And now you're like looking at the way that they live their life or their political or religious beliefs. And you're like, I actually don't believe that at all. Um, and here I am, yet contorting my life to please you. I don't want to do that anymore. So I kind of left like the corporate environment in which I looked around and was like, wait a minute, I'm actually no longer pleasing myself. What would please me? And now I'm back kind of like in this familial domain where I'm like, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't please me. What actually pleases me? And the thing with emotions, um I like to remind people and kind of like use the analogy that emotions are like a tunnel. You can only see the light at the end when you've gone through the tunnel, so you have to go through them.
It's dark in there.
It's dark in
It's
there,
scary to go forward in those things. I don't know what's gonna happen. The
right?
monster's over here. Nah, what was
Yeah.
that? Right?
And when you're constantly in situations that activate emotions, you get stuck. And that's where burnout happens.
Mm.
And I think a lot of us coming out of like COVIDian times, whether it a lot of us will relate to burnout from the professional space, but I think post COVID there's a lot of really beautiful growing body of research coming out for like caregiver burnout. So whether it's parents or caring for elders, but just like this sense of, you know, emotional exhaustion for like doing too much, too long, caring too much, too long. And then like looking at the depersonalization aspect of it. So just like totally losing a sense of empathy and kind of becoming resigned and cynical. And then moving into like a decreased sense of accomplishment. So like nothing you do
Mm.
matters. Like, and ultimately that's where I got at the office, right? Where you're just like chugging along, and you notice yourself kind of becoming a jerk. And when we were on the farm, all of a sudden, you know, I can't move forward. I have this big beautiful vision. I'm used to being my identity is used to being seen as a high performer.
Mm.
And now I'm not producing. I'm not producing results. So then
Who
who am
are
I?
you?
Yeah.
Right, right. I just want to back up for 1 second. I think it's important. When you said you were, you were at the office and you were becoming a jerk. Like in my life, I felt I had a very similar situation happen to me. And I'm curious if you felt this way. Like I felt I was being a total asshole to this guy, and I was mean to him. My friend pulled me aside and like, "Why are you being such a dick, George?" I'm like, "I'm just busting his balls." And they're like, "No, no, 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 George, you're being an asshole." And I was like, "Really?" So I had to think about it. I took a giant handful of mushrooms one night. I thought about it, and I realized to myself, I don't know, like, am I being a dick? Yep, I am. Okay, why? Why am I being mean to this person? Because he's weak. And as soon as I said it, Marissa, I realized I'm weak. And it was like this mirror, like, oh my, I had to go apologize. I felt like a dummy. I still, to this point, like, I'm like, I look back and I'm happy that I was able to do it and catch it. But when you see that, when you look back on that memory, do you see you being a jerk as like misplaced anger? Or do you see that the reason those people were making you mad, was it something they were doing, or was it a reflection of something you were doing?
Um there was a lot of like righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
So like a lot of righteousness. And I would say, to your point about misplaced anger, underneath was like this deep commitment and knowing that like we can do better. We
Who's
like we
we?
could
We? What do you mean we? Like you and the
like as
person
a
or a team?
like as our organization, like as our team, like
Okay.
we actually could be doing better. And we say these things and yet we're not embodying them.
Okay. I'm with you.
It's kind of like one of the things that I have to be careful about.
Now we're talking.
Like the integrity police will come on the scene and it's like, you're wrong. You're wrong. You shouldn't have been doing that. Shame on you. But that's like how I was like, that's where I came from. And then I got to like leave that land and go back to the originating where there's, a lot of like guilt and shame. You were guilt and shamed and fear motivated you versus being inspired to do things. And so when I think about those that inner critic in my head, ultimately like the entrepreneurship game is a whole different rodeo than corporate culture. Like I had a career path. I knew that when I followed these steps, I would get here. It could look like this or it could look like that. Entrepreneurship, holy smokes. Like it's a different ball game. And when you're not compassionate to yourself and you don't speak to yourself kindly, you're like the world's worst boss. You're like a terrible boss. And then you kind of become crippled. And essentially like that's kind of where I got.
Yeah.
A little bit during those COVIDian times. And I remember one of like the I would say the silver lining at that time was everybody went online, right? So all of a sudden, and like education was accessible online. I could participate in all these really beautiful, I was kind of like, I had moved into like optimization. So I was like quite into biohacking and optimization at the time. Not really knowing that, like I'm still interested in that, but I'm like, you gotta check out the roots. Now I know about the roots and those core wounds and shadow self and all that good stuff now. But like being able to check out these different psychedelic conferences. And I remember thinking, I think it's time. Like my folks were going to go out of town. And so, I had been doing all this research of like, how do psychedelic practitioners, facilitate ceremonies and whatnot. And so I had my husband sit for me. So I set up an evening for myself. And, at the time I had it like we were going to do this brick and mortar wellness studio. And I just felt stuck because I couldn't move forward with it because of the circumstances. And I went in and I did, I worked with psilocybin. And it was it was such a beautiful experience in the fact that it was intentional. So I think about my very first touch point, my very first experience with psychedelics at Burning Man, totally recreational. And when I look back at who I was at that time, that's actually very, I don't want to say inappropriate, but I was such a by the book, straight laced person that if it would have been, how should the right way to do psychedelics have gone down?
First dates are awkward. With a substance, with a person. They can be, but they're beautiful.
Yeah. So I probably would have been like, well, I need to do it with a shaman. I need to like be on the earth that the medicine came from. I need to have all these boxes ticked. But here I am like running around like
Yeah.
having the time of my life and
Wonderful.
just just doing it for the sheer joy of doing it. However, this time I got to be a little bit more intentional, right? Go into it with, really with the intention of like, what can you share with me? What kind of wisdom can you offer me? And I remember there was a couple different moments during the journey where I remember it would take me through some like kind of like dark scenes. And all of a sudden I could feel my body starting to contract and starting to get like that fear. And I just remember
Mm.
everybody like talking about, bad trips, right?
Yeah.
And and thinking to myself, no, just surrender, drop into your breath, surrender. And just as I would say that to myself, um, it was almost like the scene would kind of shift. And, there'd be like these scenes of like um voodooists and like really scary
Yeah.
kind of things. And then all of a sudden, I'd be like, surrender, drop into your breath. And then all of a sudden,
Mhm.
they would just kind of like soften ever so slightly and they'd look beautiful. Like I would be the observer. And it was almost like, I'm floating on that little boat and it's a small world and just being like, oh, wow, look at all these different,
That's wonderful.
look at all these different ways. Um, and ways of being and culture. It was gorgeous. And then I came out the other side and I remember just thinking to myself, I don't have to be stuck to brick and mortar. And I don't have to be stuck to brick and mortar. And I had always envisioned myself to be the owner operator, never a facilitator. And I remember thinking, the world right now doesn't need another yoga teacher teaching yoga online. Everybody's online teaching yoga right now. I don't need to add into that. Everybody's kind of
Right.
got that locked down. But I do think there's a lot of people out there like me who are dealing with really difficult emotions and don't know how to move through them. And the breath is a pretty amazing way to do this. And that's when I kind of decided for myself that I was going to become a breathwork guide and start teaching breathwork online. Just kind of backing up, I would say maybe like a month earlier, I had come across my breathwork teacher. His name's John Paul Crimmy. And what I really appreciated about him was he's kind of like no nonsense. He's from Boston, teaches breathwork in Los Angeles, but used to be a fitness instructor or like used to work at Gold's Gym, I think is where he used to work, but kind of has that like charge of, one of his token phrases is like, come on, you've done harder things than lay on the floor and breathe. Breathe. You can do it. Keep going, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing is I was used to talking to myself in that way so
Mhm.
I could relate to it. I wasn't I wasn't really great at relating to super esoteric, robed,
Right.
mystical kind of folks that would
Right.
sometimes come in the meditation space. And so I couldn't quite relate to them. I was like, I don't know, I'm not that person.
Right.
And so, you think about these healing journeys and you got to meet people where they're at. And that's where I was at that time. And the first couple breathwork journeys were wild. Just I would come out the other side drenched, soaking wet with sweat, or, just having these like massive emotional releases. And at the time, I had I had another bit different kind of birthing injury with my daughter, and I couldn't run.
Mm.
And so when you want to get that kind of physical release, or that physical kind of like you just want to go bang the shit
Sure.
out of something, and so you just
Yep.
go for a run. Couldn't do that. But I could lay down and I could breathe and I could have that physical kind of experience as a result of that. But I also got to have the emotional release, just like a big old cry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was something that I was like, yeah, I think there's a lot of people right now that are dealing with a lot of like emotions that we were never taught how
Right.
to meet, so to speak. And so that's kind of where the tables turned ever so slightly, and so that's really where the Golden Thread was born. So the Golden Thread Studio is a digital wellness studio that's designed to create connection for people in such a way that they're present to the human experience and magic of everyday moments. And I know that sounds like a little bit of a mouthful, but when you go through these breathwork journeys, um, the experience that you have when you come out the other side is probably the most warm, nourishing, yummy kind of sense of self. It's not easy to always access, right? Unless you're pretty disciplined, unless you're in that practice of like being able to move into that state. And I think we live in a society that doesn't nurture that. I feel like you kind of have to really fight for that for yourself, or be super intentional.
Yeah, it's almost conditioned out of us at an early age.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is like, we have magic all around us all the time.
Yep.
We just have to be present to it. And, you know, we have these little beautiful devices that pull us out all the time,
Yeah.
all the time. And so, yeah, so that's where the Golden Thread began. And yeah, what else would you like to know?
Well, first off, thank you for sharing. I'm always enamored by the way in which people can use language to paint pictures all the way through the airwaves. And when you spoke about the idea of going into COVID and then coming out of this psilocybin journey with the blinders off on a way, like, oh, I came through this other side and I realized I had all these limits on myself. Like, I don't need to have brick and mortar. Like, there's just so much metaphor in there. Like, you don't need brick and mortar. You don't need this particular foundation. You don't need to build on something outside. You can create it inside and then manifest it outside. And I think that's what you've done with the the Golden Thread Studio, is that you've taken something, an idea, and you've translated a vision into reality. And I think that is where this new sense ratio comes in, or where this new relationship to your senses. And I think that's emerging with other people. I think you're helping. Maybe the Golden Thread is a way to cast out a thread and pull people towards this way of translating vision into reality. Maybe you could speak on that a little bit more, because I think more people are doing it, but the more people who begin to talk about it, like, what were the stages like? You realize, okay, brick and mortar, for whatever reason, it's not going to happen. I had this other idea that maybe it's not yoga, maybe it's this breath work, but how did you take it from in here to out here? Like, what steps did you do? Was there a scaffolding you used? Was there a daily sort of regiment that you took one step every day? Or can you explain to me what that looked like?
Yeah. So when I was building the brick and mortar space, looking back at all those practices that brought me a lot of support, so to speak, um, in terms of like accessing joy, in terms of being able to move stress through my body. What I was able to kind of pull apart the components were, I was working with my physical body, my emotional body, mental, and even spiritual bodies. And one of the things that I was starting to really notice when I was in Los Angeles was, especially LA, everybody has this like obsession with the physical body, and we go to the gym to work on it and to refine it. And like my relationship to my physical body and working out and everything was just so I didn't look terrible naked. Not to be strong, not to be vibrant, not to have longevity, any of that stuff. But then I kind of started getting curious, like, how do you build your capacity for resilience? How do you build like mental health? The mental health conversation started coming on the scene around that time as well. Where do you go to work out your mental health? Yes, there's therapists, but like there was still quite a, like, I don't want to say a stigma, but like you can only access them if you have benefits or money, or there's not like a fitness gym on every corner. Also noticing that people more than ever are like leaving organized religion and being able to like, how do you gather and build community? And those were kind of like these components that I was like, I want a space where people can gather in community. They can be with one another. They can teach each other. It's kind of like a co-led space where if there was someone like myself who was, brand new to the practice of self-care. So taking that girl who like didn't even know how to like take a freaking break, and kind of putting her beside like maybe someone who I am right now, and just prefacing, I don't have it all together. I'm like totally in the messy middle, maybe novice-y, junior novice. But like, I in a million years would never have had a conversation about psychedelics, right? But thinking about being in my yoga class and being in those networks of conversations of somebody saying in passing, yeah, I just went to a retreat in Costa Rica, and I had like the most beautiful ayahuasca experience. And then you'd be like, oh, what's that all about? And it's these kind of like little pebbles, these little stones to kind of like help guide people on their journey, right? That's what I wanted. I remember I was going to a meditation studio in LA, and you had to check your cell phone in. You walked in, you checked in, everybody had to leave their cell phones at the door, and it was this big, beautiful communal space while you waited to go into the actual meditation room. And damned if people didn't have to like talk to each other. I know it sounds so silly, but like, people had to talk to each other, and being able to see what's available for people when you ask them how's their day or what's important, like what's important to you? Like what a beautiful generative conversation starter, and so when I was looking at brick and mortar, like I knew that's all kind of what I wanted. But looking at these different modalities, the breath was the one that thread everything together. Like you're able to hit and deliver on your physical, your mental, emotional, and spiritual bodies when you're doing breath. And so I already had like my business plan. I already had like, I got all my vision and Pinterest boards of like what the brick and mortar is supposed to look like. And so it was actually kind of like a pretty easy switch to take it onto, onto online. So if you look at my website, I remember when I was telling the, like it's Wix, and I'm like, I know what I want. This is exactly what I want. I'm like, don't you dare give me something white and airy with me like in some flowy gown, throwing my hat with like handwritten scrolly stuff. I'm like, I want dark. I want glamour. I want the human experience. And I think that's one of the things that we cut ourselves off to the human experience so often. Like whether it's our family telling us like we can't or we shouldn't, or our, just like Western culture has these stigmas around accessing these different parts of emotion. And it makes you feel like it makes you feel like you're a little bit broken, or it makes you feel like you're less than because you're going through those spaces, and you're not. They're totally normal. We just haven't embraced them as a society. There's lots of other societies and cultures and wisdom traditions in the world that fully embrace them and like honor them, you know?
Yeah. When I think about that, the way in which other cultures are able to embrace different parts of the journey, I'm also fascinated by the relationships people have towards trauma and their loved ones. I know in what you've written and in some of the things that I have gone through, trying to explain something, a trauma that you went through with people you love, and have them not really respond in a way, probably because they don't want to talk about it, probably because they have a bunch of bent up feelings about maybe they didn't do something, maybe they wish they would have done something, maybe they know they pretended not to do something, but whatever it is, that door's going to stay shut. We're not going to talk about that because it's going to cause a problem for me, you know. Have you encountered that too, when you have this issue that you're working through, or this idea that you want to fix, and you try and go, you know what, I'm gonna talk to my friend about this, or I'm gonna talk to my mom or my dad about my brother or my sister, and they're like, I don't want to hear it. Like, what do you do in that situation? Have you been there before?
George, you like poked the big bear.
I know.
I didn't even really talk about that in my share in Randall's book. I kind of like briefly.
It takes one to know one. That's
right.
Why.
Well, I would say 95% of the discomfort of going through COVIDian times on the farm at my folks's was because I was still very much in the psychedelic closet. So not being able to be like honest and truthful, and the fact that I want to build a wellness studio that is like a love letter to Burning Man and is a full of, and is full of practices that yes, move stress through your body, but you're able to access these expanded states of consciousness similar to a psychedelic experience. So contorted, so bent up into that good girl, firstborn, people-pleasing role, where like I didn't want to tell them that I was out there railing around on a, dancing on the playa,
right?
with whatever it was at that time. Right.
Why is that shame?
Yeah. Oh God. Yes, of course. I didn't want to upset them. I didn't want to disappoint them. I didn't want to deal with the response of like, of being totally shamed. And
how old was the girl on the swing?
she was about 7. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, she was about 7.
I'm just piecing it all together. So okay.
Totally. And so I'm gonna say it was probably about a year, maybe a year and a half, when I finally decided to come clean and share with them that I was like, I can't continue like this, and it's actually making me really sad because I'm actually lying. Like it kind of showed up in my world. Like I was lying, like I'm no longer being authentic because I'm not telling you the whole truth. And so I sat them down and wanted to share, and it came out incredibly awkward. And my parents weren't interested in hearing it. They weren't interested. And I remember, they, I'm just noticing myself right now of coming up with stuff because I'm like, oh my God, if you hear this, they're going to be so ashamed. Okay, I'm getting all red and flushed. But yeah, so what happened was I said, I want to share with you about my life. And I wanted to share how I was a workaholic, and both my parents work very hard. They work very hard. And when you want to make new choices for yourself, and those new choices are different than their behaviors, you don't want to upset them. You don't want it to come across like it's a criticism for how they live their life. And I think that's how it was taken. So there was, there was their response. And they weren't, it was kind of like a mock, almost mocking me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I interpreted it. And I remember becoming completely enraged. Like, we go back to that, like, there's a stressor, which creates an emotional response, and then stress floods the body. I moved right into fight. Like, was like, how can you not see me? And that's one of my shticks, is like, nobody sees me. And so to have lived there like a year and a half, and to have never been asked about my business, like, hey hun, how was your day? What are you working on? Like, what are you working on? That's interesting. Meditation. Maybe you could teach me some meditation. Maybe you could teach me some breath work. Why do you find that fascinating? Why do you like that? Those kinds of things were never had. And when I go back to thinking about parenting and mothering that 7-year-old girl, all of a sudden Mama Bear just like totally came out. And I think everything that I have never said in the last like 40 years of my life all came like, it wasn't pretty. It was terrible. It was like it was like actually a really rough
It was
scene.
necessary. It was necessary.
And I would say like that's where the grief came, like rage. And then we moved into grief. And the grief was like, I really wanted them to care about what I cared about, And so when I found out like that was actually not going to happen, and so kind of like more of that magical thinking of like how these identities of parent-child look, I just noticed this was one more pillar that toppled over as a result of like post-psychedelic experience. So coming out of, corporate culture, looking at like leadership and bosses and stuff like that, C-suite, you think that they're separate from you, or they think that they have it all together, and they're just human. They're just human beings doing human being things. Same thing with your parents. They're just human beings doing human being things. And I really got to see that. Like, I got to see my parents in a new light, like as peers, as human beings trying to do human things, instead of like these superheroes that should show up a certain way,
Yeah, I totally know. I wish more people would know. Like, it's so hard to, first off, it's incredibly inspirational and courageous to see someone use the catalyst of a situation to break a pattern, to break a generational pattern. That is fucking amazing. Like, you'd be like, I would give you a giant hug right now. Like, it's incredible to understand what people go through. And I think what happens is that, like, when you start looking back, when that grief comes, one thing I have found is like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. But had it not been that way, I wouldn't be who I am. Like, all of a sudden you can begin to see everything that happened as a catalyst, as a sort of chrysalis from which a new form was born. And that for me becomes a way in which I can cope again instead of like, okay, oh God, that was horrible, or I cannot believe they fucking did that. And the rage is there. But then you go, it was necessary. I wouldn't have had the
Yeah.
insights. I needed. It's not that I wanted it, and it's not. I guess on some level you needed it in order to become the new form. And a lot of people,
Totally.
you know what I mean? Like if you don't have that, you can't become this. And then people don't want to go through it, so they stop. But
Yeah.
you
And I would say like in the new form, like I would say like that last thread of looking for external validation, like wanting to people please,
yeah,
like wanting to please the leaders, wanting to please the bosses, all came tumbling down. Looking at, I can see how moving forward, I would have been constantly looking over my shoulder, being like, do my mom and dad approve? Do my mom and dad approve? Is this okay? And now, like, knowing that they weren't really watching anyways, I'm like, okay, well, what the hell do I approve? What do I want? And I think like that was the last pillar to kind of go down, that brought me back to, girl, it's you and only you. And you got to stand on your own 2 feet and you got to fucking figure out what makes you happy. Here we are again. What makes you
yeah,
happy?
yeah, yeah. Welcome to you. Welcome to the world. You know what I mean? I. That's why there's
That's
all those
why they call it
metaphors.
the work, sir.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is so, it's like, you think like, transformation, you come out the other side and it's all gonna be like gumdrops and unicorns and softness.
right, right. People need that to go in the tunnel. Oh, it's gonna be beautiful. Come on. The other side's gonna be beautiful. Come on. We should trick them to get them in there. That's why there's a trickster. Like it all fits together in so many beautiful ways.
Yeah. And so like I would say like afterwards coming out that and yeah, dealing with grief, it was almost actually a little bit like a loss, like
Sure.
feeling like there was a death. Like I think that vision I had of like the relationship I thought that we had, it kind of, that one ended and a new one can begin.
Yeah.
And that's really when I was like, well, what makes you happy? And I'm like, I, hand on heart, believe psychedelics can make a difference for people, like with their mental health. And, that was back then. And right now, like right now, today, this past year, I've lost a lot of people due to mental health. That I'm not saying psychedelics are the end all to be all, but I do think that they help. And I think that if people had more access to them, if people knew more about them, they could definitely help folks, you know? And I could see how by me being quiet, there were some folks that maybe, like, you always wonder, maybe it could have helped, maybe not. But I'm not interested in being quiet anymore. And so shortly thereafter, I was like, no one cares anyway. I'm gonna
Yeah.
like really going for it. And yeah, we started getting I started pulling up different search terms for Canada and psychedelics, and I came across an organization called Sisters in Psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they had a summit in Vancouver, and I had the opportunity to be their volunteer coordinator and kind of take a little bit of a leadership role with the community there. And I remember being at the summit and looking around and being like, well, fuck, these are my people. Like now I don't feel like such a weirdo. Like
Yep.
like I've been on a farm around, farmers and
Yeah.
oil guys. And they're like, you know, lovingly, but they're like, you left your job in Los Angeles to now go teach people how to breathe.
You're a drug addict. What's wrong with you? You've lost everything. Well, who do we
Right?
raise?
Right?
Jesus Christ. For school and everything to throw it all away? To throw it all away for this?
Yeah. Yes.
I
Yes.
know.
And
All of
so
it. It's gone.
you think you're like this total weirdo, and you're like, and you just get like utterly lost in these really disempowering conversations about yourself. And then all of a sudden, you get chucked in this community of like-minded individuals who are chemists, therapists, botanists, anthropologists, like legit professionals in the community, medicine women, shamans, like the mystical,
Yeah.
legitimate people in the industry.
Yeah.
And I'm like, fuck yeah, this is, and I remember even at one point being like, this is where the witches are hanging out. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Find the
And
others.
and yeah, and I just remember being like, yeah, these are my people. And so I went on to open up a chapter here in Calgary. And unfortunately, they had to. Sisters in Psychedelics has closed their organization, but they, everybody still stays in conversation and in community, and we're all in people. I think one of the beautiful things is that even though leadership could no longer continue that conversation, the community itself was like, well, we don't want to stop. We want to keep going.
Yeah.
And so, it kind of morphed into, like, the chapter here has morphed into Calgary Women in Psychedelics. And so I host women's share circles once a month here. And, out there engaging in the community, whether it's above ground, below ground practitioners. But I think, I thought that there would be a pretty clean pivot from my experience in education, sales, marketing, bringing products and services to the marketplace from, like, corporate beauty. I thought I'd be able to do this, like, really clean, swift pivot into psychedelics. We haven't dimensionalized yet, like that. The psychedelic ecosystem hasn't dimensionalized yet into that way where, like, I find myself bumping up against conversations of, like, I don't have an ist on my name, therefore I can't play. And so I find myself bumping into those kinds of constructs now where I'm not allowing myself, how do I want to say this? I'm finding myself holding myself back because
Right.
it should look a certain way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I think that's all changing, and I think it's part of the whole dynamic of what's about to unfold. I see things on the horizon that fundamentally redefine what a title and a word is and who's capable of what. And Marissa, I love talking to, I really enjoy this conversation. And I feel like we just scratched the surface. And I think that if I didn't have to go pick up my daughter right now, you and I would probably talk for another 2 hours. This is fascinating. And I got through maybe 5 of my questions, and I think I have like 12 on there. So you're going to have to come back, and we'll have to do a second part because I think we can really unpack some more stuff. Maybe we'll bring a panel together and have more voices in the room.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, Marissa, where can people find you? What do you have coming up, and what are you excited about?
Yeah. So people can find me at thegoldenthreadstudio.com. So that's the website. And then they can find me on Instagram at the Golden Thread Studio as well. And then I've got so there's a couple different ways that you can play with me when it comes to the breath. So I'll do private breathwork journeys. And then we'll also do group. And group can either be a private group or we can do open group. And I've been doing a lot of like psychedelic integration ceremonies for folks. Breath is like really beautiful as an integration practice. And so when it comes to like microdosing cohorts or women's groups, women's circles, just even like a freaking corporate, like so many people will take their staff out and get them wasted for as a Christmas party. And it's like, well, how about instead of getting hungover and messy, we all go inwards,
Yeah.
And we'll
Way
do some
better.
breath together. So that's what those are some of the different ways that they can play. And, what am I excited about? I'm just really excited for what's to come within this ecosystem. Honestly, I love
Yeah.
being able to hear all the articles and all the movement that's been happening.
Yeah, it's going to be epic. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Please go down, check out everything Marissa has to offer. She'll probably be back in a week or so, but go down, check out the studio. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. And that's all we got for today. Hang on briefly afterwards, Marissa, but I'm going to say hang up with our friends. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we got for today. Thank you. Aloha.
Thanks.
Yeah.